Thank you. This is amazing tonight. It's laid out sort of like the old Copacabana in Goodfellas with all these little tables here and people coming in, popping up. I've been writing for The New Yorker. Next year it'll be 30 years that I've been writing for The New Yorker. Thank you, but here's what's interesting. I've been writing for the wrong 30 years, essentially. If you're part of the relationship from, say, the age of 20 to 50, that's the good part of the marriage. If you're there from 60 to 90, it's not really a marriage of the magazine. It's more like taking the old lady out for an outing in the chair and going around in those 30 years. But though I've been writing in the magazine for 30 years, I've actually been writing for the magazine for much longer than that. They simply weren't aware of it in those early years, or when they were aware of it, they were extremely unenthusiastic about it. Because the truth is that I came to New York in 1980 with the intention of immediately starting to write for The New Yorker, and came down from Canada. I went to McGill, which is sort of the Cleveland of colleges. Some people know it. And my then girlfriend and soon wife, we got married at City Hall that December, and I rented the world's smallest apartment. Now, these days, if you come to New York with literary ambitions of any kind, you go to Brooklyn. But in those days, the far eastern reaches of the Upper East Side was Brooklyn, with the significant exception that where in Brooklyn you can still get a kind of plain little square-cut apartment with a bathroom and a bedroom and a living room. In those days, the apartments you got were really essentially drawers. You were placed inside a drawer, and then they shut the drawer, and you worked for so many years, and then, if you were lucky, they opened the drawer again, and you had a job. And our apartment, our first apartment, in a basement on East 87th Street by First Avenue, was one 9-by-11 room. And in intermission, you could go pace that out, how big a 9-by-11 room is. It's about the size of a rectangle right around me. And it was the entire apartment. The bathroom was here, the kitchen was here, and our desks were there. And I spent all my time every day in that little 9-by-11 basement apartment writing pieces for The New Yorker, short, amusing pieces about contemporary life, which I would then walk the 50 blocks down to the old offices on West 43rd Street, and I would slip them under the door, and 2 weeks later they would come back with a form rejection slip, and the next week I would slip another one under the door, and it would come back. It was a kind of a circle of life that was going on. But Martha, my wife, who was at school at Columbia, somehow thought this was not a completely sufficient career path. And she thought that I should get out of the house and do something while we were waiting for The New Yorker to react more positively to what I was writing. And so she wanted me out of the house. Now, getting out of that house was very much like being in that house, because the house was only the size of a closet anyway. But she wanted me out of the house, and I went out and I found jobs, temporary jobs, while I waited for the job at The New Yorker. And I had some fascinating jobs. I had wonderful jobs in those years. For a while, I was the grooming editor of GQ magazine. And that's true. And that meant I was in charge of all the copy having to do with moisturizers, having to do with shampoos, but I was not allowed to touch the copy of anybody who wrote about perfumes or colognes. That was a totally separate thing. But I loved that job. It was a wonderful job, always editing a copy on moisturizers, and endlessly interesting. And GQ in those days was a welcoming place for young talents. There was a young sports writer named David Remnick who was writing regularly for it as well. That's where our paths first crossed. Remnick denies that to this day. He's in total denial and has destroyed all of the relevant issues. But in fact, that's where we both began. But before I got that job, I got my first job when I left that little room. And it was a job at the Frick Art Reference Library. And I'm sure all of you have been to the Frick collection, right? St. Francis and Ecstasy, Rembrandt's self-portrait, Fragonard's The Progress of Love. Well, the Frick Art Reference Library sits immediately above the Frick collection, and it is where the progress of love stops. Completely. It is a kind of little, or was in those days, 35 years ago, it was like a little chunk of the 19th century in New York. But not the good 19th century, not the 19th century of gas lights and horse-drawn carriages and Christmas trees. This is the 19th century, was kept intact there, of miners being fired on by strikebreakers. We have the 19th century of open sewers, the 19th century of strange illnesses that swept through immense populations of immiserated people. That's the 19th century that was kept intact there. And the whole library was run by the formidable figure of Miss Frick, the son of Mr. Frick. And the librarians themselves tended to be sweet, elderly European ladies, and there was me. Now, I thought I would be good working in a library because I love books, but really working in a library isn't about loving books so much, it's about remembering where books are. And that I am not very good at. In fact, I am probably worse at that than anybody alive. But they put me in charge when I went there. The job they gave me was to run the authority file. That sounds fabulous, right? You run the authority file. And what the authority file is, it's one file, one filing cabinet in a library in which you have the name, the proper spelling, and the birth and death dates of every artist who's represented in any way in a book or a picture in the library. It's the authority file. And if you've got a birth date and a death date, if you've already died, your card drops below the rod. It drops below the rod. In other words, you can put the skewer right through it. And the head librarian got to do that at the end of every day. You put the skewer right through it, you're below the rod. But if you're still alive, your card sits above the rod still. And my job was to get all the newspapers from around the world that arrived at the library, cut out the obituary pages, and search them for artists. Search them for artists who had just died. And if I could find artists who had just died, I went to the authority file and saw if they were in our collection. And if they were, and I had a death date, I got to drop them below the rod. And if you had a really good day, you could kill 4 or 5 artists in the space of a day, and you would tell the head librarian, I think I got 5 today, and she'd be delighted, and we'd press the skewer right through their cards, and they were below the rod. This was the high point, this was the bright spot of my life there. The low point was that when I wanted to call home to Martha, there was only one telephone. It was the old-fashioned kind of telephone that you wrap up like this, or that ring phone, and there was a sign beside it that said, please disinfect the phone after every usage, which should have been actually after each use, but, you know, I wasn't at the New Yorker yet. And I would think to myself as I searched old newspapers or new newspapers for relevant obituaries, I think, what were the diseases that we were disinfecting the phone for? They must have been consumption and neuralgia and lumbago. All of those 19th century diseases you would read about in a Louisa May Alcott book, scarlet fever, things that hadn't been around in that long. I don't have any skill at remembering where books are, makes you a poor librarian, and I also don't have any gift for remembering where to go to get things. I lose everything. That's a fancy way of saying. And so my first day at the library, they gave me, in addition to my scissors to cut out obituaries, they gave me the key to the stacks, which sounds like a great thing to have, the key to the stacks. You could put the key in, you'd open it, and then you could go look for any book you needed for your work. And promptly within an hour, I had lost the key. I didn't know where it was. I didn't know where I had put it, and I had mislaid it. But I couldn't very well go and tell them that the new authority of the authority file had lost the key in the first hour of work. So I had to find a way to slip into the stacks for the work I needed to do there. So what I decided to do was to sort of wait by the stacks for someone else with a key to come by, and open the door, and I would kind of catch them in conversation, sort of like somebody selling starch or ironing boards on the old boardwalk in Atlantic City. You struck up a conversation and then slide into the stacks along with them as they open the door. This is a rather laborious way of getting access to the stacks in the library in which you're working, but it went on this way for a year. Finally, one day, I'm waiting outside the stacks, having killed off 3 or 4 Spanish artists, grabbed a Venezuelan sculptor, and knocked off 1 or 2 minor abstract expressionists in the course of the morning. So I was feeling very good. Because part of the pleasure of a job like running the Authority File is that pretty soon you start to feel like one of the fates. You're not just registering the deaths of artists, you're causing the deaths of artists. So in a relatively good mood, considering that I hated the job and I hated the place and I hated everything about it, I saw in the door of the library there was a key. There was a key. And I thought, oh, this is good. I'll finally replace the key that I lost with this new key that I found. So I gently plucked the key out of the door and I put it in my pocket and went back upstairs. About an hour later, there was a huge hubbub and a commotion. And I said to somebody, what's the problem? What's everybody upset about? And they said, all of the librarians have been locked inside the stacks in the dark because someone removed the master key. Now, somebody with a really good character at this point would have returned the key, confessed the mistake, explained the earlier absence, and gone on in that way. Somebody with a bad character and a vivid imagination, someone who was destined to write for The New Yorker, in other words, would have decided that the best thing to do was to go home and start writing again without recognizing it. Now, Martha, my wife, insists to this day that I actually behaved semi-responsibly, which is about the best she ever hopes from me, and that I went back the next day and gathered all my stuff together and resigned properly. But in my memory, I left the Frick Art Reference Library at that moment and realized that whatever my fate in life was to be, it would not be that. And I went home and I wrote a simple sentence. I wrote, I am a student at the Institute of Fine Arts and I work part-time at the Frick Art Reference Library. And I looked down at it and I said, that's a New Yorker sentence. And indeed, that would be the first sentence of one of the first pieces I would sell to the New Yorker 6 years and many jobs later. But that job, that first terrible job, has stayed with me ever since because it gave me the fundamental realization of mortality and fate that every writer needs to have. I realized that we are all floating above the rod for a very brief time. That someone is searching the newspapers of the galaxy and the cosmos for news of our demise. And that we will certainly be dropped below the rod as surely as everyone else has ever been. The claw of the head librarian gets us all in the end. Thank you very much.